I do hope you're being truthful with me, Watson." I could see that his suspicions were not allayed. I even began to wonder whether my restless period of waking the previous night had itself been a dream, and whether I had been sleepwalking. Such things are possible, I know, and the heat, my fatigue, and the events of the last days had left me so baffled that in that moment of confusion I could not entirely rule it out. "What happened," he said, "was that I was walking through the station concourse when I spotted you by the wall of the restaurant, which by then was closed, talking to a man in a brown felt hat. I would have approached you, but when I caught your eye, you cut me as dead as if you didn't know me, and I assumed your conversation was of some importance. The more I thought about it, the more I thought it was a poor way to treat a good friend." Suddenly the fog in my brain gave way to an horrific clarity. I knew that I must rid myself of Cartwright at once. "Thank you for telling me this," I said. "It is of the utmost importance. But, Nicholas, and I pray you won't take this amiss, I must ask you to leave." "To leave?" "Please. This is a fearfully serious business. There is real danger." "You're not just trying to get me out of the way, Watson?" "That's exactly what I'm trying to do, Cartwright, but for a very good reason. Believe me, you will have your story." "Very well, John. Very well." At the front door he patted me amiably on the shoulder. I shut the door on him and leaned against the wall, trying to get my thoughts in order. Holmes had instructed me not under any circumstances to trouble him again, yet this situation was possibly critical. If Tobias Organ had hired some impersonator to look and sound so like me that even Cartwright, who had known me for years, could be convinced, then Holmes might also be deceived, and then what power they would have in their hands. If I could not speak to Holmes, I could at least alert him by other means. I ran up the stairs with the idea of writing a note which I could slip under the basement door, but as I reached our rooms, I heard a cry from the street. Without thinking, I ran to the parlour window. 100 yards southwards along Baker Street, 3 men were struggling. 2 of them were bundling the third man into a cab against his will. It was Cartwright. I dashed down the stairs and ran into the street. The driver of the cab had already whipped up the horse and moved off at a lick, but I gave chase, fury and outrage fueling my progress. I pursued them for a good half a mile until eventually they outpaced me, and I stood gasping for breath outside St. Vincent's Church. I sat on the pavement. I needed Holmes's help. The transgression of a broken promise was a trivial thing, surely, in the context of this appalling incident. I would go to him immediately. Aware that, in the haste of my pursuit, I'd left the front door of the house open, a new anxiety overcame me. Clearly this kidnap was the work of Organ's ruffians, and who was to say that they would not take advantage of an open door? I trotted as briskly as I could back to Baker Street. But the door was no longer open, and on such a close and windless day I thought it unlikely it had been closed by a draught. The horrible thought occurred to me that someone may have already got in, and then everything seemed to tumble into place. Cartwright's abduction had been intended to draw me out of the house so that the man masquerading as myself could gain entry. Holmes would be unaware of this. He would eventually open the door of the basement to his assailant, and believing it was myself he was admitting, would offer the easiest of targets. I had left the house without a key, but I knew there was a possibility of access via the rear of the terrace. This entailed my knocking at the door of our neighbour, Mrs. Harben, an elderly, amiable woman who seemed happy to allow me access to the rear of the building. Here I was obliged to scale a wall to the yard outside the back of our own dingy basement, the front room being that which Holmes had taken for his makeshift laboratory. There was no light within. I opened the door with infinite slowness. The noise of Holmes's experiments seemed to have stopped. The door that connected this room to the front half of the basement was 6 or 7 short paces away, but it was too dark to see whether the bare floorboards were liable to move and groan when I trod upon them. I tested each step before lowering my weight, and moved with the floating motion of a rather overweight pantomime artist. 1, 2, 3. Then there was movement behind me. A hand was clamped across my mouth and an arm locked around my throat. The grip was expert. I could not breathe or move. The hot breath of my assailant in my ear whispered, "Doctor, do not cry out. I'm going to release you and you will turn round slowly and face me. You must not make a sound. Tap my hand if you understand." I reached up to the hand around my throat, and obediently I tapped it. The arm released me, and as quietly as I could I took a deep draught of air, turning as I did so. "Lestrade!" "Shh! Yes, Doctor. Wasn't expecting you here. Or rather, in a sense I was, but since you are just about to arrive, I wasn't expecting you to come in the back way as well." The policeman smirked at his little conundrum. "Will you explain to me," I began, "what on earth you mean?" "Not now, Doctor," he said. "Glad you're here, though, sir. An additional pair of ears. Up close to the door now, and listen, it won't be long." It was indeed less than a minute before we heard the door from the front of the house opening into the laboratory, and the arrival of what sounded like 2 men. The door was closed with a thump, and a gruff voice said, "So this is it?" "Yes, this is where he's working." There was something familiar about that second voice. "And he won't be back for a while?" "No, half an hour, I should think." At that moment, with a shock, I recognized the other voice. It was my own. I turned to Lestrade again, but he just put his finger to his lips and indicated that I should continue to listen. "So what's the plan, then?" asked the gruff voice within. "To match the bullet that killed Max Zimmerman with the ones from your gun," said my voice. "The police know you killed him, but they need Holmes to provide them with evidence that will convince a jury." Evidently, I thought, the gruff character is Tobias Organ. I heard him pace about, then spit noisily. "Zimmerman's not the first one I've topped, and they've never got me yet. They say you only got £4 10 from him." "Never you mind what I got. Anyway, I never killed him just for the money. I killed him because he gave me a bad look. He gave me a bad look, and I gave him a bad headache. A bullet right between the eyes. Now, let's deal with this little problem." Suddenly there was a tumultuous crash, as if one of the walls had fallen in. "In we go, Doctor," said Lestrade. He pushed the door hard, and we rushed into the laboratory, where Organ had kicked Holmes's equipment flying in all directions, and where, to my amazement, I saw that he was now being attacked by myself. A perfect duplicate of me cracked him a right hook, then a left hook, and then felled him with a blow to the side of the head. Organ hit the floor like a sack of cabbages. Lestrade was on him in a flash, cuffing Organ's arms behind his back. Lestrade blew his whistle and then proceeded to arrest him. As I stood back to get a better look at my other self, the duplicate doctor put a hand to his own face, wrenched at his upper brow, and pulled and stretched until he had removed his entire face, revealing, beneath the peeling mask, the flaming eyes of Sherlock Holmes. The next moment Lestrade's officers came bursting through the basement door, and Tobias Organ was dragged away. The heat of the day had given way at last to a pleasant evening. Mrs. Hudson had returned to the house and provided Holmes and myself with an excellent evening meal. Now we sat with our brandies, and Holmes with his pipe at the open window, where a gentle breeze lifted the curtains and refreshed the parlour. "As you will have deduced," Holmes was saying, by way of explaining it all to me, "the object of the masquerade was to lure Organ somewhere where we could extract a confession from him by subterfuge." "But your ballistics experiments," I said, "would they not have been enough to convict him?" "It is a science only in the imagination," Holmes said. "And though one day I'm certain it will be more than that, there is much more work to do than I could accomplish in a fortnight. But Lestrade and I agree that if Organ believed himself to be at risk from my experiments, he would wish to destroy them. What on earth were you doing in there, Holmes, if the thing was a complete hoax?" I'm afraid I did deceive you a little. I was not in there all the time. The mechanism of an old railway clock and a device employing elastic and a drum skin were intended to give the ear the impression of ongoing industry. Well, it certainly deceived me, I said. But was it really necessary for me to be incarcerated for the duration? I'm afraid so, my friend. If Organ, through one of his spies, had got wind that there were two Watsons, the trick would not have worked. What's more, it was necessary for him to believe that you and I had quarrelled, and therefore that the good Dr. Watson might be in the market for a bit of betrayal. Unfortunately, your friend Cartwright saw me meeting Organ's accomplice at Marylebone Station, and almost let the cat out of the bag. It was necessary for us to put him somewhere safe. Lestrade's men kindly subjected him to a temporary and very comfortable period of kidnap. It was you who had him dragged away. Yes. I had not calculated that you would follow him, of course, or that you would be locked out and find yourself clambering in through the back. But it turned out well. You will make an additional witness for the prosecution. Do you think they'll convict him? Oh, yes, Watson. His confession today was as clear as a bell. Tobias Organ will hang. As for you, my friend, I have given you a terrible time, and as a reward, I'm going to take you to the opera. Tonight? Yes, tonight. Gilbert and Sullivan. The Mikado. But, Holmes, my memory is you don't much like Gilbert and Sullivan. No, Watson, but you do. And besides, I have to confess to having a soft spot for the Lord High Executioner. The Conundrum of Coach 13. On an October morning, when rain streamed from the black clouds that swept above our Baker Street lodgings, I found my friend Sherlock Holmes in a similarly overcast mood. He had not had a case in weeks, not at least what he called a decent case, and he had been huffing and puffing about the house for 2 days. It was with some relief to both of us, therefore, that we heard the slowing approach of a cab in the street outside, and both moved eagerly to the window. The hansom did indeed stop directly beside our door, and after a moment a large and finely dressed middle-aged gentleman emerged into the downpour, paid his fare, and rang our doorbell. Holmes was smiling. Now what could make a rich American so distressed, Watson, that he would come pell-mell here to us from Paddington? An American? I said, drawn irresistibly, as usual, into Holmes's tantalizing games. Certainly, and I think a formidable character. And do you wish to tell me how you deduce all that, Holmes? I deduce his distress and his nationality from the fact that he just tried to pay the cabby in American dollars before recalling which pocket held his pounds sterling. As for his coming from Paddington, that was the easiest of all, for the driver of the hansom is Henry Brown. I'm surprised you do not recognize him, who always works from the Paddington rank. As ever, Watson, I apologize for the banality of these observations, but you did ask. By now there were footsteps on the stairs, as Mrs. Hudson escorted the visitor to our apartment. While I inwardly delighted to note that my friend had returned to his amiable best in anticipation of a new challenge, I found myself praying that it would be a challenge worthy of his powers and his pent-up energies. No sooner had the door opened than the huge, rotund figure of our visitor, bright in a cream suit, burst into the room like an actor onto a stage, determined to establish his character instantly. "Mr. Holmes!" boomed the American voice as both his arms swept forward to grasp my right hand. "Benedict Masterson! What a great privilege to meet you!" "Delighted, but I am Dr. John Watson," I replied. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes." With equally booming apologies, he bowed charmingly to me and turned to my friend. "Ah, yes. Now I see. Unmistakable, unmistakable." The impression given was that he had found the first Sherlock Holmes of his acquaintance a little short of his expectations. "Mr. Holmes, I wish to ask you to act for me in a business both mysterious and distressing." "You had better sit down, Mr. Masterson," said Holmes, "and tell us everything." And having settled his cream-covered bulk into an armchair and accepted a cigar, on which he continued to puff anxiously as he spoke, the American told us his story. "I am a dealer in gold, gentlemen. Gold has been my life. My father owned small mines in Nevada, which gave us a comfortable living. In my turn, through judicious trading, I've made these assets yield a fortune. I came to London last week because your own Bank of England had made an order for a substantial quantity of gold bars to boost its reserves. The bullion was shipped into Bristol Harbour and transferred yesterday onto a chartered London train for transfer to the bank. I have been in London doing the paperwork, of which there is, let me assure you, no small amount. And I went to Paddington this morning to meet the consignment. The train was there, the gold was not." "I see," said Holmes. "Stolen?" "Undoubtedly. How much?" "We're talking 4 or 5 millions, Mr. Holmes. That's a large loss. Is the gold insured?" "Indeed it is, but you know insurance companies, Mr. Holmes. They are ever suspicious, and the circumstances of the gold's disappearance are, to say the least, rather strange." "The details, Mr. Masterson," said my friend, "if you please." "Well," continued Masterson, tapping a thick cylinder of ash into the ashtray, "I'd asked to commission an overnight train, and also insisted that it be discreet, not armored or escorted, or in any way having the appearance of a specially secured conveyance. I was offered the charter of a passenger train which returns empty from Bristol to London once a week, and which railwaymen jokingly call the Bad Luck Special, not because anything has ever happened to it, but because it normally consists of 13 empty passenger coaches, as indeed it did on this occasion. I insisted that the gold be packed in steel containers, each locked with a unique key. You will appreciate that gold itself, gentlemen, is a weighty metal, so each box contained only as many bars as would enable the containers to be carried. In order to prevent the possibility of them being removed from the moving train, I ensured that while they were small enough to go through the open carriage door, they were too large to pass through the windows, even with the windows slid down to their largest aperture. I then arranged for the doors of the bullion carriage to be locked from the outside so they could not be opened until the train reached London." "The train was empty, then, apart from the driver and fireman of the locomotive?" "No, Mr. Holmes. It is railway practice for all trains to have a guard, a practice I was very happy to comply with, since it meant my consignment would have an overseer throughout its journey, and to this end all the steel cases were loaded into the last coach of the train, coach 13, where the guard could keep a constant watch on them. The man employed for the job was a Mr. Lyons, Mr. John Lyons, a mature and trusted employee of the railway company." Here, strangely, Mr. Masterson stopped and smiled. I inquired whether he had ever worked on the French railways. Gare Lyons, you see. Gare de Lyon." Holmes smiled politely and nodded. "Forgive me, gentlemen, I could never resist a pun. To continue, the train left Bristol at 3 this morning, as scheduled. But when it arrived at Paddington at 6, the steel boxes of gold were gone. Mr. Holmes, this was an impossible robbery. The train stopped only once for a minute or so to take on water. Hardly time to unload a single box of bullion, let alone 100 of the darned things, weighing in at 150 pounds apiece." "And the guard?" asked Holmes. "Lyons claimed that he fell asleep somewhere into the journey and woke to find the bullion disappeared. He's being held at Paddington along with the driver and engineer, but all ardently protest their innocence." "And with regard to other suspects, can you think of anyone in your organization who might feel inclined to take advantage of you?" Masterson pinched his lips and looked embarrassed. "Well, if I may confide something to you in the strictest confidence, My estranged wife, Laura, still has shares in the company. She believes that she should have more. There is, some bitterness in this regard. However, I know Laura well enough to doubt that she is a thief. My friend simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Masterson. I will certainly take the case on. Would you be so good as to wire Bristol and inform them that Dr. Watson and I are on our way?" "I will, sir. You mean to go there today?" "Indeed, yes, as soon as I have made a check or two at Paddington Station." "Well, I surely thank you. I can think of no better hands in which to leave the case of the bad luck special than those of Mr.